What if everyone could clone themselves once? It might sound like science fiction, but scientists are actually pretty close to making human cloning a reality. So let's talk about what would happen if this technology actually existed. First things first, every person would be faced with a rather large moral dilemma. You could use your clone for menial tasks like having them do your homework or take your shifts at work, or you could replace yourself with them completely, letting your clone take over your identity and live your life for you. Obviously, there are a lot of ethical issues with human cloning. But for the sake of a fun movie and a thought experiment, let's just assume that all of these ethical issues can be overcome and that human cloning is now possible. So what would happen if everyone on the planet could clone themselves once? The global economy would change overnight. Just imagine for a second, all of a sudden there are two of everything. There are two doctors for every one patient, two teachers for every classroom, two janitors for every building. In theory, this would mean that all of the jobs in the world would effectively be cut in half. Some people would argue that this would be a good thing. After all, more workers would mean more productivity and more economic output. However, this isn't really true because of something called opportunity cost. Economists define opportunity cost as the value of the next best alternative foregone. To put it simply, if I spend an hour doing one thing, then that's an hour I can't spend doing something else. So the opportunity cost of spending an hour doing something is the value of the next best thing that I could have done in that hour. Because of opportunity cost, even if we did have twice as many workers, it probably wouldn't make any difference in terms of productivity. Why? Because for every two workers, there would be one unemployed worker. And if there was no unemployment, then the extra worker would just add to inflation without adding anything to GDP. But the biggest impact of human cloning wouldn't be felt in the economy, it would be felt in every single one of us. Because if you could clone yourself, then who owns your memories? Who owns your job? Who owns your life? These are obviously very complicated questions with no easy answers. What's more, some people might want to try and answer these questions in very drastic ways. If you could clone yourself, then you could also clone someone else. In fact, you could clone anyone you wanted, whether they wanted to be cloned or not. This would be especially true if people's identities were tied to their DNA. After all, if you have the same DNA, then you're the same person, right? Wrong. In fact, identical twins often have vastly different personalities, even though they have the exact same DNA. This suggests that our DNA doesn't determine who we are. Instead, it only provides a base level of nature from which nurture can build. In other words, if you cloned yourself, it would be a different person. That being said, it would still be a part of you. And if people believe that it's wrong to destroy life, then they may view destroying a clone as tantamount to destroying a person. This would obviously lead to a massive explosion of identity crises. Not only that, but people could be forced to confront their own mortality head on. After all, if you could clone yourself, then you could also die without consequence. In fact, some people might want to do exactly that. If you could clone yourself once, then you could theoretically live forever. Of course, this would require some serious technological advancements, but it's still a possibility. Or perhaps people would use clones as immortal backups. That way, if you died, your clone would live on to carry on your bloodline. Clones could also be used for much more nefarious purposes, like using them as unwitting soldiers in war or as expendable assets in crime. There are really too many possibilities to consider here. The point is that if humans had the ability to clone themselves, it would change everything. Laws would need to be rewritten, religions would need to be re-evaluated, relationships would need to be redefined. Nothing would ever be the same again. Of course, this is all just speculation. Human cloning is currently not possible, and it may never be, but that doesn't stop us from wondering what would happen if it was possible. Do you think you would clone yourself? If you could, would you use your clone as a worker? Or would you replace yourself with them completely? Let us know your thoughts.